Well, thank you very much, and thanks to Semex for the invitation to come and talk to you today. I'm not quite as tall as David, and if I stand behind this podium, there's every chance that you won't be able to see me. So I'm going to walk around the stage a little bit. For those of you I haven't met before, I'm Donald Moore. As mentioned, I'm the executive director of an organization called the Global Dairy Platform, and I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, which means that every time I leave Chicago, it snows, and I get one of these nasty texts from my wife, like I got this morning, pointing out that as I boarded the plane, it started to snow, and she'd now shoveled 4 inches of snow off the paths, and when would I be home? So I think it's probably a good idea I stay here a little longer, given that it's likely to snow again tomorrow. But anyway, as mentioned, I used to work for a little dairy company down in New Zealand called Fonterra. And in my 10 years with Fonterra, I was lucky enough to represent them on the boards of most of their joint ventures in parts of the world, in Japan, in Taiwan, in China. In fact, I was the chairman of their farm ventures in China, in South America, in South Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe in a venture they had in Germany. So I was lucky enough to spend a lot of my time traveling around the world, meeting with particularly dairy farmers and processors in all different parts of the world, which gave me a really interesting and unique insight into the role that dairy plays in different parts of the world and in different markets. And so moving into Global Dairy Platform for me was a fairly logical move at that stage back in 2010, because it gave me an opportunity to expand my own horizons and understanding of the world markets. What I'm going to talk to you about today, on slides that don't have pictures on them, I don't know what happened to them, but hopefully when I get through this presentation, the pictures will start to appear, is the future of dairy marketing. And I thought I would start perhaps by just telling you a little bit about who GDP is. Hands up if you've ever heard of the Global Dairy Platform. Can't see many hands there. I'm going to take one slide and just tell you about Global Dairy Platform. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we believe to be the drivers of the global agenda. And David did touch on these in his presentation, but I'm going to give a slightly different flavor to them in what I'm talking about. Then what we see as the opportunity for dairy. And finally, I want to talk about where we see dairy marketing going, the future of dairy marketing in different parts of the world. So, Global Dairy Platform, there's only one slide I've got, and all I've done here is put up a list of our members. But the Global Dairy Platform was formed back in 2006 when the CEOs of Friesland Campina, and back in those days it was Campina, now Friesland Campina, Arla, Fonterra, and Dairy Farmers of America got together. And they sat around a room and they said, there are many things that we compete on, but as cooperatives, there are quite a few opportunities and challenges that we have in common. And wouldn't it be a good idea if we consolidated our efforts on those pre-competitive issues and freed ourselves up to run our own businesses in our competitive areas? So they formed Global Dairy Platform. 4 founders back in 2006. We've now grown to about just under 90 members around the world. And our membership split into 2 categories: commercial dairy companies and industry associations. So the names at the top, and this is an eye chart, there will be a test at the end to see if you've remembered all the names on here. The names on the top of that chart are commercial companies, and they pay to be a member of Global Dairy Platform. The companies on the bottom half of the chart are all of the industry associations around the world, and we allow them to join Global Dairy Platform for free, and in exchange we simply ask that they share their pre-competitive research with us so that we can make that available on a global basis. Now, David mentioned, and it was kind of buried in the bottom of one of his slides, something that goes on in the United States, which is called the Dairy Import Assessment. So not only do we get money from commercial dairy companies, but in the United States, they charge 7.5 cents per hundredweight of imported dairy product into the US on a milk equivalent basis. And 2.5 cents of that 7.5 cents can be directed by the importer to what's called a qualified program. So Global Dairy Platform is one of the qualified programs in the US, and that helps fund a number of the initiatives that we have underway. Money that comes from the import assessment can only be used for a couple of things: research or education and promotion. So we've got to be quite careful how we use the money that comes from those sort of sources. Our original strategy within Global Dairy Platform had 3 components to it. It was, and David touched on some of this again, it was to address the imbalance in the research and understanding around milk fat. It was to address some of the sustainability challenges that the dairy sector was facing, and it was to promote the nutritional richness of dairy. And those were the three strategies, or the three pillars to our strategy when Global Dairy Platform commenced. I'll talk a little bit about where we're at as I go through the next few slides, but I thought it's probably worthwhile me just spending a moment and talking about at a global level, what do we think are the drivers for the dairy agenda? And the first one, again, as David's probably covered in his, is this issue of population growth. There's a projection that the world population will grow to 9.6. Some people say it's closer to 10 billion now by 2050. So there's more people. But the other part of that challenge is that the people aren't coming in the parts of the world that we typically think of as being our large population bases. They're not coming in parts of the world that are nutritionally secure today. Most of the people who are going to arrive on this planet in the next 20 to 30 years are arriving in parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, which are not known as being nutritionally secure. So we're going to have more people in more places. And those people are going to have more money. Now, one of the things that we're very aware of and very conscious of is as these numbers, by the way, reflect the number of people in the world who are in what we would call the middle class. So today there are 2 billion people in the middle class. By 2033, that's projected to be 4.9 billion people. And the first thing that happens when you start to have disposable income as a mother is that you go out and you look for better nutrition for your children than you had yourself. And so as people move up the curve and become better off economically, they start looking for ways to provide better quality food for their children. And so that's going to drive demand for dairy products as well. But capping that off, there are more problems than we've had in the past. And this particular slide is looking at a study that came out from the UN back in 2012 about non-communicable diseases. And it said that there are 4 drivers in the non-communicable disease area, and they are cardiovascular disease, cancers, diabetes, and chronic lung disease. And that a large portion of the deaths, somewhere out of 3 or 5 deaths worldwide, are preventable. And it's also a huge impact on the GDP, in this case gross domestic product, not Global Dairy Platform, of a lot of emerging countries. Somewhere between 3 to 7% of GDP in some of these emerging countries is being spent on trying to address the issues associated with non-communicable disease. So there's a huge problem facing us in the world at the moment, and how does dairy play a part in solving that as well? And that all boils down to we require solutions ultimately, and this is how the United Nations through the FAO and Biodiversity International have formed what they think is the solution to some of these problems, and it's this topic of sustainable diets. And within Global Dairy Platform, we're actively promoting the dairy sector within the UN agenda and the role it plays in addressing the question of sustainable diets. How are we going to feed more people? How are we going to deliver better nutrition? How are we going to address some of these challenges of non-communicable diseases? And how are we going to improve the economic and social prosperity of people in these emerging nations? So what's the opportunity for dairy? Well, I thought before I went through that, I might just share a few numbers. And correct me if you've seen these before, but this is a study that we recently commissioned, produced for us by IFCN, the International Farm Comparison Network, in conjunction with FAO. And the first one was they gave us a number of 121 million dairy farms in the world today. And on those dairy farms, there's an average of 2.9 cows. So when we think of dairying in Europe or in the UK or in the United States where I'm living or in New Zealand where I used to live before, we think of dairy herds in the hundreds. The average around the world is 2.9 cows. I don't know what 0.9 of a cow looks like, but that's what they've worked out as the average. There's 121 million jobs, full-time jobs created by the dairy industry worldwide. About 48 million of those are on farm, and the other 70 million are up and downstream from the farm. And that's quite a tight definition. In the United States, they recently did a study in California where they analyzed it, and they worked out that for every one on-farm job, there are 8 off-farm jobs created up and downstream in California. In fact, they went as far as to say that the Californian dairy industry was bigger than Hollywood in terms of the number of jobs it created. So we've taken quite a tight definition here in coming up with these numbers of jobs. So 120 million jobs worldwide. There's 1 billion people whose livelihood depends upon the dairy industry. Now, we're not talking consumers here. There's 600 million people living on dairy farms around the world, and a further 400 million people whose livelihoods depend upon the dairy up and downstream from that. And then we get into consumers. Now, the study we got back said there were 7 billion consumers of dairy product in the world today. I think that would be assuming everyone ate dairy, and I think it's probably better to say there's more than 6 billion consumers out there, and on average they're consuming about 131 kilograms of dairy products. But as David pointed out, in some parts of the world, and in the UK as a particular example, what we're seeing is a skewing at the moment of that consumption by age group. And so we're seeing that the older groups are consuming more dairy product, and the younger groups, the groups that we need to bring into the dairy category, they're not consuming the way we did when we were kids. You know, when I was a younger man growing up, I actually grew up in Northern Ireland, so David and I are neighbours. But when I was growing up, my grandmother would say to me, "Drink your milk, it's good for you." What's happening nowadays is people aren't getting that same positive reinforcement, that message. They're getting a different message from their grandparents. They're getting the message about things like, be careful when you drink your milk because it makes granny, gassy. It's not necessarily the same message as drink your milk, it's good for you. So just in terms of the opportunity, those are the numbers. And when we start talking to people within the UN context, I've been at a number of UN meetings recently, including the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals, and you're sitting in a room full of all these dignitaries, and you've got people from a lot of the big agri-business companies there promoting their view on sustainability or their view on nutritional security. And we start talking as dairy. Dairy is a very diffuse industry. It's very, very disparate. Lots and lots of different companies in different parts of the world. Some of our competitors are much better coordinated and much better aligned than we are. But when you start sharing these numbers with people, 121 million farms in the world, it blows people away. They start to understand the size and the scale of the dairy industry. Something I didn't mention, if you look at countries like India, India is the single biggest producer of dairy product in the world. The largest cooperative in India has got 3.6 million co-op members, families that produce milk for that co-op. They have an average of 2 cows per family. And those cows produce somewhere around about $1 a day worth of income to the families per cow. So they're getting $2 a day from their 2 cows, and that $2 a day pays for the education, the clothing, and the food that family consume. So the term cash cow is used quite often in India when they're talking about the role of dairy in their marketplace. So the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was a strategy that within Global Dairy Platform we've been promoting for the last 6 to 12 months. It's called Designing Dairy's Future. We think there's an opportunity for us in the dairy sector to take a much more positive position for dairy going forward. We think there's an opportunity for us to start being less defensive about our industry and starting to promote more the positive role that dairy can play. To do that, what we're doing is linking dairy solutions to key issues affecting society. Those issues I talked about as the global drivers, growing population, the demand for better quality nutrition, etc. And when we do that, let's not go out there and say, here's a study from the dairy industry about the role that dairy can play in improving stunting or malnutrition. Let's rely instead upon the evidence and the science that's being produced by independent bodies, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN itself. But to do that, the dairy sector and everyone in this room needs to get more involved and take more of a leadership position themselves. When you go and attend some of these meetings that are being held, dairy is almost absent from the discussion. You've got all the other major commodity groups there, but there's nobody in there really representing the dairy sector. So one of the things that we're talking to the leaders in our organization about is the need for them to get more involved in promoting the positive messages, the positive role that dairy takes in different parts of the world. And in doing that, we need to start readdressing What is that pre-competitive space for dairy? Where can we as an industry collaborate together, and where do we draw the line between what is pre-competitive and what is competitive business? So now the real purpose of my talk today was about the future of dairy marketing. And I've got a couple of slides I just want to share with you here. This first one I really hesitated to put up, but in one slide it really is the strategy that we have within the dairy sector or within Global Dairy Platform for promoting dairy on a global basis. This is our communications and marketing strategy. And really, the only thing you need to take away from this slide is three things. The three pillars to that promotional activity are firstly, increasing the relevance of dairy. So increasing dairy's relevance message across all those different platforms, be it nutritional security, sustainability, or dairy development. We need to increase the messaging around the relevance of dairy. We need to start determining how we engage with and who are the key influencers for dairy in different parts of the world. And the third piece in here is quite a new and emerging area, and it's what we call affinity group marketing. And this really leads us into a whole discussion around the role that social media and new forms of technology play in the way consumers are starting to make decisions. And I got to say, having done a lot of work in this area in the last 12 months, this is something that we ignore at our peril. If we're trying to appeal to a younger age group, we have to really understand the role that affinity groups play in the way they make decisions about what they consume and what they believe day to day. The other thing I wanted to say about this slide, and we had a really interesting marketing conference back in June of last year in Copenhagen. The biggest challenge we have as a dairy sector when it comes to marketing and promotion is staying positive. We had a book came out last year. Judith, when was it like? What was that book? It was Got Milked. Came out March. So there's a book last year published by a Canadian author, came out in March, called Got Milked. It was due to be launched, I think it was on a Tuesday or a Wednesday one week. We sent out an email to a bunch of people on the Friday the week before, and we had almost, by Monday morning, we had 45 people signed up for a conference call to discuss how we as a dairy sector globally were going to handle this new book that was coming out, this anti-dairy book. So within 48 hours, over a weekend, 45 people signed up for this conference call. We ran the call. Judith was on it. In fact, I think we gave you the task of summarizing the book, didn't we, Judith? She wrote a book report, and we sent it out. It was a negative, compelling event. We knew when the launch was going to happen. We knew what the book was about. We were able to get 45 people from about 32 countries on one call within 48 hours. Huge success in terms of getting people together and sharing and coming up with a single strategy. Where we as an industry struggle is when we have something positive to say. When we have something positive to say, there's no compelling event. So when I go out and say to people, hey, there's 1 billion people out there in the world involved in dairy, let's start promoting that message, there's no compelling event. So it's very difficult for us to encourage people to align behind a single strategy. So one of our biggest challenges is creating compelling events for positive messaging, not just for negative messaging. So diving down another level of detail, and talking about dairy marketing. This is just a timeline which you can't read at the back of the room, and in fact, even at the front of the room is slightly hard to read. But I did just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that's gone on in dairy marketing for the last 5 or 6 years. In 2010, when I first joined Global Dairy Platform, I was the head of marketing at Fonterra for their ingredients business worldwide. And I'd never sat down and met with generic marketers or brand marketers in one room. So 2010, in Montreal, Canada, for the first time ever, we had this meeting of those people responsible for generic promotion and people responsible for brand promotion from most of the big dairy companies in the world got together. And the objective of that meeting was really to determine how generic promotion and branded businesses can work together on a global scale. Coming out of that, we developed a model for that engagement and collaboration. And there were a couple of things that we identified pretty early on. The first was that as a global dairy industry, we had lost the emotional connection with consumers. And most of our campaigns, most of our marketing, most of our promotion was really around the functional benefits of dairy. And somewhere along the way, we drifted away and we'd forgotten about the emotional appeal that dairy has to consumers. So we conducted a study using Behaviour and Attitude, which is a Dublin-based research firm, do a lot of work with companies like Diageo on their Guinness brand. We used them to help us determine what were those emotional drivers. And we actually said, here's your brief. We want you to look at what is a consumer's emotional connection to dairy across their life. And they came back pretty quickly and they said, well, there's 3 things wrong with your brief. The first is nobody has an emotional connection to dairy. They have an emotional connection to milk or cheese or yogurt, but they don't have a connection to dairy. So we said, okay, we'll use milk as the sort of proxy for a relationship with dairy. They said the second thing that's wrong with your brief is that there isn't a sort of a continuum of relationship. There are life events that define different relationships. So there's an event around moving into motherhood, which defines a change in the relationship somebody has. So we ended up breaking that emotional relationship down into major life stages and life events, and looking at what were the relationships and what were the key triggers of that emotion for consumers during those different stages of life. We then moved on and developed what we called a marketing architecture. And the marketing architecture is going to be important for the next couple of slides, where we look at what's happening in dairy marketing or dairy promotion in different parts of the world. And out of that marketing architecture, we came up with 2 key platforms. This is primarily for generic promotion of dairy, so for category promotion. And the 2 platforms we came up with were Dairy Goodness and Life Force. And dairy goodness is what most of us might understand from our years in the dairy industry, and indeed in the UK. I think it's probably where your position has been for quite a few years, promoting the nutritional value and the benefits of consuming dairy. And in many markets, it's the default position. The promotional strategies tend to focus on dairy goodness. But in most markets that we looked at, although that was the basis that they were communicating with consumers, they'd never actually sat back and said, what's our strategy in this area? It was something that had simply evolved over 50, 60, 70, 80 years in terms of their engagement with consumers. But what was happening in that same time period was consumers were drifting away from their connection to farming in particular. When I was growing up, and I'm sure most of you in the room were growing up, everybody knew a farmer. Well, most of you are farmers, so I guess you probably still know a farmer. But what happens nowadays is most consumers, they've moved so far away from that, they don't understand what's going on farm. They've lost that connection to the dairy farming community. So the first platform we developed was around what we called Dairy Goodness. The second was an edgier platform. It was moving dairy into a more modern context, and that was the area of Life Force. And a number of the examples I'm going to share with you in a moment build on that concept of Life Force. So 2012, 2013, we launched this marketing architecture. And the way we work in Global Dairy Platform, we invite the whole dairy industry to the meetings that we hold on this sort of topic. We run what we call an inclusive strategy. It doesn't matter whether you're a member of Global Dairy Platform or not. If you're interested in this topic, we'll invite you along to the meetings so that you can participate. Since 2013, when we launched the architecture, it's been picked up by about 8 to 10 countries around the world who have now got elements of their strategy based on this particular architecture. That's a slow start. We'd like to see more people involved in it, but it's a good start. Moving on from there, more recently, we've been working in the area of the future of dairy marketing. So what we've said is we've established a baseline for how we should communicate with consumers based on these architectures. What's the opportunity now moving into the future? How do we move to that more positive dimension rather than being more defensive about the way we communicate? So I wanted to talk about some of the milk campaigns around the world, and I've got a few examples on the screen here. When you talk about generic promotion, a lot of people tend to think of it as being ad campaigns or billboards, etc. Promotions really spans the whole gambit from education right through to potentially advertising. There's 4 examples, I think, up on the screen there. One of them I'll talk a little bit more about on my next slide. It's the European Milk Forum promotional activity, Milk, a Force of Nature. But what you're seeing up in the top right-hand corner, your left, is a campaign out of Canada which is really an internet-based campaign aimed at a much, much edgier relationship with teenagers and the dairy industry. And so it's based on lots of short viral-style videos where consumers can go and click on those and they'll see milk being used in everyday life. The campaign at the bottom, there's two things there. One is a game that's aimed at younger children, and the other is a campaign that talks about milk gives you go, and it's based upon sort of rock star type performers, etc. Over this far side, we've got a campaign from Chile, actually from Latin America. It's from FAPALE, which is the Pan-Latin American Dairy Association, and it runs right across Latin America. And it's got over 50 organizations involved in promotion of dairy, and it's really largely around an education campaign for consumers. And then up the top is the one I just wanted to talk a little bit more about. This is, I think, a really important and a really interesting development. Back in 2011, 7 European countries came together and said there's an opportunity for us to collaborate on messaging for dairy in our marketplaces. They formed the European Milk Forum. The 7 countries were Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, Northern Ireland, Ireland, and Belgium. And since then, Norway has also joined this particular group. And they have 2 dimensions to their campaign. So Northern Ireland's part of this, representing the UK. They have 2 dimensions to it. The first was an education and consumer awareness program they called Milk Nutritious by Nature. And that ran for about, in fact, I think it's still running today. They ran a series of conferences where they invited in key influencers from the health community, from government agencies, and from, I mentioned health, nutrition, etc. And they brought them in and they would educate them on the role that dairy plays, largely around things like saturated fat, which David mentioned before. The second part of the campaign then ran a little bit behind that, and it was called Milk, a Force of Nature, which had this really interesting ad with knights running through glasses of milk and so on. Really, I think it picked up quite nicely in a number of the markets that it was run in, but there's a few learnings that came out of that, and the first learning was that you really need to tailor, although the 7, 8 countries could come together and come up with a creative, you still need to tailor that for your local market. You need to include imagery that resonates in the local market, and you need to include figures and people who mean something in that marketplace. So you can't just have one generic ad that runs all over the world, I was going to say, but all over those different markets. So this was then somewhat tailored based upon each market, and what we're seeing here is, I think, a couple of the examples out of Northern Ireland. So that was a really interesting exercise. It continues to go ahead. This group has got funding out of the European Commission to help support the work that it's doing as well. Next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was some of the changes that are going on in North America with their advertising campaign. And I think this is David Beckham up here. Everyone probably recognizes David Beckham in this part of the world. Other parts of the world, you have to explain who he is, but down here, I guess you all know. But for many, many years, in fact, over 2 decades within the US, they had built this campaign called Got Milk. Got Milk is probably the most iconic milk campaign in the world, and I think you ran a version of this in the UK for a number of years as well. This particular campaign ran for over 2 decades. It started in California, where they designed the whole Got Milk, the Milk Mustache campaign, and it was all based upon celebrity promotion of dairying. That's my favorite, Susan Sarandon at the end here. But the interesting thing was that despite many, many analysis of the value of that campaign, it was very difficult to determine whether or not it had actually increased the sales of milk during that time period. Liquid milk consumption in the US has been falling by 1% to 3% per annum for quite a few years, and it continued to fall despite however much money that was put into this campaign. So at a certain point in time, the US said, enough, we've got to put a halt to the Got Milk campaign, and they're spending tens of millions of dollars a year on that particular campaign. And they started to look at how can we engage with consumers in an edgier way that is more directly relevant to their daily lives. And they moved into this campaign that's on the my left, your right-hand side of the screen, which is called Milk Life. And the whole Milk Life campaign, again, builds off that architecture we talked about before, which is Life Force. Looks at the role dairy plays in everyday life and uses everyday consumers rather than celebrities. And the campaign has started to see an uptick in certain segments of the milk market. Interesting thing I should have mentioned before on the European Milk Forum campaign was that the post-advertising, the results that came out of that advertising campaign moved the demographic in all areas except teenagers. This particular campaign in the US has been very much aimed at teenagers, and it's starting to move that milk consumption in the teenage bracket. The other thing it does is it very much focuses on occasions, and so the slogan down the bottom makes a mention of consuming 8 grams of protein during breakfast by consuming milk. So it's also linked dairy back into that breakfast campaign area. And in the US, in conjunction with Quaker Oats, they're starting to do a lot of breakfast promotion campaigns as well. So what do we see really working in the dairy industry when it comes to generic promotion and generic campaigns? The first thing that we really see is that you've got to keep it focused on the positive messaging and fact-based. There are a lot of opportunities to engage in negative dairy promotion or dairy activity and some of the websites that are out there at the moment. And that occasionally people have slipped into that. They've wanted to defend dairy. Somebody comes out with a blog and says something negative about dairy. And the natural tendency is you want to defend yourself. Our recommendation is avoid that. Avoid it at all costs, because for a lot of these people who are out there promoting negative messages about dairying, the moment you get engaged in their discussion, you're actually increasing the audience they have, you're increasing the eyeballs. So don't get involved. Where you do have to, just get involved by promoting the correct messaging based upon scientific evidence. Don't get engaged beyond that. As I mentioned before, do stay in that emotional level. Make sure that you have an emotional appeal for consumers backed up by the scientific evidence. Whoops, went one too many. How do I go back? Thank you. Reach out to consumers using their language. One of the things that I think we really have to do when we're communicating to consumers, and it's never more apparent for me than when I go and visit our members in China and places like that. We have to use the language that resonates with them in their marketplace. It's no good talking to them in the way we want to discuss dairy. We need to make sure that we're using their own language and channels. This whole area of influencers, that to me is one of the keys. We need to make sure that we're keeping the channels open for dairy by ensuring that those key influencers, medical profession, regulatory, etc., that we are continuing to position dairy with them. And we need to, as an industry, make sure that we have better alignment and communication globally, and that's part of the role that Global Dairy Platform aims to provide. For us as an industry, 20 years ago, you could run a campaign in the UK, you could define your market, you could run that campaign, it stayed within your borders. Today, with the internet, a campaign run in any part of the world in English is available to your consumers in the UK. So that's why we're really keen on making sure that we have collaborative effort going on across the world and that we're sharing the same sort of messages around dairy. And last for me is these must-dos for the sector. We've got to create urgency around positive stories. We have urgency when it comes to negative. How do we as an industry communicate a positive story with the same energy and enthusiasm and indeed dedication that we're seeing from people when we have something negative to defend ourselves against? To do that, we need to develop more collateral so that we've got it available to share and to generate collaborative action. We've recently put together a strategy around this, communicating this billion people involved in the dairy industry, and that's something we've shared with all of the people who come to our marketing conferences. And then we just need to be clear about who's going to do what. What is the responsibility at a local level, at a regional level, and at a global level. And the last thing in closing I'd just like to say, we run our annual marketing conference every year. We've run it for 7 years. This, I think, is our 7th year. And this year it's going to be in San Francisco. Last year we had it in Denmark, the year before in Paris. If you're interested in how dairy comes together to promote the generic category of dairy, then I would encourage you to come to this meeting that we're going to have in San Francisco later this year. Just in closing, I wanted to build on a couple of comments that David made. For those of you who don't know, the United States have just launched the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for 2015. Huge issue. They spend over a year going through the process of consultation and sharing their scientific reports, and then finally they launch the dietary guidelines. So the 2015 dietary guidelines were launched in early 2016. That probably isn't a bad thing. It normally takes them at least that long to get them together. In the 2015 dietary guidelines, they have continued to maintain a stance that no more than 10% of your intake should be of saturated fats. That's caused quite a stir in the United States. There's been a lot of commentary about the fact that that does not represent the latest scientific understanding. However, you've got to remember that a lot of these people have built their entire career on telling people not to consume saturated fat. The other thing I would mention is that dietary cholesterol has finally been removed from the U.S. dietary guidelines. So what was it, 20, 30 years ago, they started telling people that you shouldn't consume dietary cholesterol, which was eggs. So you shouldn't consume more than so many eggs because dietary cholesterol is bad for you. It builds up in your arteries, etc., etc. The science came in nearly 20 years ago to disprove the dietary cholesterol claims. It's taken 20 years to get them out of the U.S. dietary guidelines. So maybe in another 20 years we'll reverse the position they've got on saturated fat and start to see more balance in the milk fat category. That was probably my comments. Thank you very much.